Well, welcome to another of the Brigham Young University Family History Library broadcasts, reminding everyone that these broadcasts are recorded and are uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. I just looked at the YouTube channel and I think we have like 578 or something like that videos up there. And of course, we have 2 or 3 or 4 going up each week with the classes and the webinars. So you're always going to find new information on the YouTube channel. Those the classes and webinars are also posted on our on the BYU Family History Library website. So all of this is really helpful. One other thing I would mention is that the Brigham Young Family History Library has now, we're back in person in the library, but we also have a live virtual help desk. So if you go to the BYU Family History Library website, you'll see a link in the upper right-hand corner that says virtual help desk. And that is manned, womaned, or however you want to put it, by a person all day long, every day that we are there. And that is now currently Monday through Friday from 10 o'clock in the morning till 8 p.m. on Monday through Thursday, and then until 6 p.m. on Friday. Those hours may change or not, but they may change in the future, and we may as we get more missionaries. This is an interesting topic. This kind of an introduction here. This will have 5 different topics. The first one is resolving the outcome. And I guess I'll put up the one that has resolving the outcome. And then they will work through the alternatives. We'll explore the possibilities. We'll define the objective. And then what to do after overcoming your brick walls. What's the next step if you actually find the people that you're looking for? As kind of an introduction here, I would point out that, well, first of all, some of the ideas for this series come from this book. It's called Genealogical Research, a Jurisdictional Approach. It was by Jones, Ekel, and Christensen. And this is I'm not recommending the book as such because it's been long published and you may be able to find a used copy of it, or you may be able to find it in one of the larger genealogical libraries. But the ideas are things that have permeated genealogy for many, many years. And this is sort of the basis for the idea of how consistently how most genealogists across the field advise people to resolve their brick wall questions, their questions of what they think is the most difficult thing to do. I'm going to use examples from the FamilySearch.org family tree. The reason why I use this is because it's readily available and free to everyone. That's like a very important factor. The second most important factor is that it's a summary in a sense, because it's a single comprehensively cooperative family tree. It will reflect the research of many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have contributed over the past 150 years. So it saves a lot of time in checking in a variety of different sources from what we had previously, which was paper. And I always like to refer back to the fact that I spent like 15 plus years before I got through finding out all the work that had been done on my family. And even then, I did not know all the work. I just knew what I was able to find in a stack of family group records about 3 feet high. So you can imagine how much information I had to go through. And the idea here with the family tree is all of that information, all thousands of family group records are all in the family tree. Every last family group record that I handled is now part of the family tree. So when a lot of people do that, you can imagine the power of this particular website to resolve some of the issues. And that's not even beginning to question or to depreciate at all the fabulous additional resources we have in some of the subscription sites like Ancestry and Find My Past and MyHeritage and Philae and a few of the French websites. There's just a fabulous amount of online research. And of course, if you think that genealogy websites have all the records, then you probably need to get into this, into doing some research yourself and finding out that there's many, many millions of other locations where records can be found. Okay, so there are three possibilities for the resolution of a genealogical brick wall. There's three things that can happen. The first thing that can happen is you find the information you need to identify the parents of the brick wall target person. Now I'm going to explain a little bit about the words that I'm using here, what this means. When we talk about finding the information, that means we're finding records that substantiate a link between a child and a parent. That's the crucial set of records that needs to be documented before you can make an assumption that someone is the parent of a child. You can do this. There's no limit on the number of, or there's lots, an unimaginable number of ways that could be substantiated by records. Anything from DNA to a birth certificate. But we don't always have all of those factors. We don't always have the availability of DNA or birth certificates. So there's a lot of other records out there. But we also need to focus on the fact that it's the parent-child relationship that is what justifies, if you want to use that term, justifies movement back one more generation. Absent that, no matter what happens, it's all speculation. And I'm going to probably say that more than one time. The second one is after an extended and intensive research effort, you still cannot identify the target person's parents. Now that, and what I mean by target person, I mean the person that you think is the brick wall. In other words, you can look at it from two different standpoints. The last person in the line, you could say that was your brick wall because you can't find that person's parents, but actually the parents are the brick wall because you can't find them. The person is there, usually identified. And most of the time, the problem is that last in line person or the brick wall person is the one that you can't find very much information about. That's the one perhaps all you have is a name, and that is the end of that, of what the records have shown. So we're going to call that person the target person. That's the person that we eventually would like to document and substantiate through some very credible resources and be able to find further information that will lead us back to the next generation. Okay, and the last one, of course, is you give up and pass the brick wall on to some of the researchers, somebody else. You say, I'm tired of this. I'm never going to find it. I'm just going to let somebody else see if they can find it. Well, basically, if you understand the way that genealogy research works, every single line you have, all 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, et cetera, lines that you have in your pedigree, of the number of grandparents goes up, so do each of the number of lines go up. And basically, at some point, every one of those lines reaches a brick wall. And I don't mean they go back to Adam. That is not what I mean by a brick wall. And I will clearly define a brick wall once again, and that is, it is when you do not have a credible source record that substantiates a parent-child relationship. That's the definition, my definition of a brick wall. Okay, so now it's important to understand from your perspective, my perspective, that those outcomes have happened to me several times. That's just something that happens. As a matter of fact, I'm working on a couple of very legitimate, what we could easily call brick walls this morning, because I have been so far unable to find even a vague mention of the people that I've reached in these particular lines. Question comes up here as to how far back can you credibly believe that you can carry a pedigree line in a Western civilization context, meaning not as opposed to something like Chinese or Japanese or where there's traditions that go back hundreds and thousands of years in some cases. Well, the answer to that is very simple for Western European derived genealogy, and that includes most of the major countries of Europe and almost all and a lot of other countries out there, including North and South America. So the answer to that is quite simple. It's when the records run out. And so when the records run out depends on the country. And some countries, like Spain, for example, can go back, have some records, some few records that go back into the 1400s and the 15th and 1300s. That's into the 15th and 14th centuries. However, most places in the United States, for example, the earliest records are when? 1776. Oh, what a coincidence. It's when the country came into existence. So when you look back at these countries, you have to look at the history, because the history will tell you pretty clearly the earliest records that you can have in any particular jurisdiction. What are the earliest records here in Utah? 1847. Before that, there were people here, but the records that we have are not particularly helpful genealogically. So understanding that fact is one of the basic things that we need to come to grips with. We need to be able to understand that at some point in time, we are simply going to reach the point where the record does not exist. And if we spend the rest of our lives looking for that record, that may or may not fall into the category of being obsessive. But I would suggest that there's always a time that you have to say, well, I'm not going to find it. That does not mean that you won't come back to it sometime in the future, but it's better to take those and put them on the back burner, let them sit there for a while, and let the records, more records accumulate, you have more records digitized, and perhaps at some point in time that record will come out. But from a standpoint of reality, the curve begins at the present for the number of records that probably are available. And there's a little bit of a gap in that curve because it's actually easier to research people in the 1800s than it is to research people in the late 1900s. So when you're involved with, it depends on the level, of course, of where you're actually doing your research. Okay, so let's move on. And to understand that, and this is what I'm saying, is that some brick walls are really the end of the line. And the end of the line means there were no more records. And so that's just the reality, that someplace and some point in time, the people that you're descended from were not recorded. There were no written records that were made of those people, and they are gone at the end of your line. And it can happen basically it could happen easily in the first generation or in the second or third or fourth or fifth. In other words, it really doesn't matter time-wise from the present when that end of line occurs. It just occurs when there's no more records. And the most common examples of this are foundlings. That's babies abandoned on the church doorsteps or at a police station or a fire station. And or orphans where no records were kept of who the parents were, and in other circumstances. And so basically you can get to a point where you can adequately support a conclusion that this person is the named person is your ancestor, but you have nothing which substantiates a parent-child relationship. So you have your end of the line person. And those ends of lines have been going back. There is a lot of promise here because I inherited, as I indicated by saying it took me so many years to find out what had been done, I inherited a lot of end of lines. And in the first 6 generations, we had a half a dozen people who we could not had not previously had their parents identified for the 150 years of research that had been done. And now we have gone at least back 1 generation, and in some cases, multiple generations on every one of those lines. So there's promise, and it does take work, and it does take a lot of research. So the conclusion here is that every ancestral line, every, no exceptions. I don't care if you're a royal line and you claim royalty back to, Charlemagne. That the lines reasonably and based on actual parent-child relationships end long before you get back into that distant past, believe me. Regardless, and I understand, and I've every time I say something like that, I basically get feedback that says, "Oh, but I found this line all the way back." Then my question is, yeah, eventually you're going to, the rule here is that royal families had children, and their children had children, and yes, there are descendants of royal families. So yes, sometimes people do tie into royal families. As a matter of practical reality, you may not be aware of it, but every royal family in Europe has been identified to the extent that modern research has made it available over the last probably between 50 and 100 years of research. And that database is on Family Search. And if you don't know where it is in what's called genealogies. It's not individually identified, but if you go in there and put in the name of someone you think's in a royal family, there's a very, very, I wouldn't say 100%, but it's very close to 100% that person has already been identified as a royal family. So we already have that. That's all been done. I begin to lose interest as soon as I know that. And I also, for those of people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, need to know all their work's been done. So that's not one of those things that we're going to get into in this kind of a discussion. Any entries beyond the end of the line are pure fantasy. That's it. And you can imagine things all you like. You can claim my great-great-great-great-grandfather was Andrew Jackson or Thomas Jefferson or whoever you're fixated on as being a descendant of. But the second you lack a parent-child relationship, you're at the end of the line and you're no longer related to anyone. Even if in Family Search Family Tree, the line does go all the way back to Adam. And if you like that experience, just go in and look for Adam in the garden or Eden or, Mrs. Adam or whatever. Okay, Eve. They've got it all in there, believe me. Interesting. Okay. Now, don't confuse a lack of research with a brick wall. the fact that you can't find that person does not mean that that it's a real brick wall. A brick wall is real. A brick wall means there are no more records. But don't just assume that you've looked everywhere. I have people come up to me. This is the most common conversation that happens when this subject comes up. They come up and they say, I have looked everywhere and I cannot find. And I go, everywhere? Where is everywhere? Tell me where you've looked. That would be the kind of that would be my pleasant response. But if I want to, I say things like, well, then how did you like the British Library? Or, whatever. And that way they say, well, I've never been to the British Library. Well, okay, but did you look in the British Library? No, I have never looked in the British Library. It usually takes just a few seconds to determine that everywhere doesn't mean everywhere. Everywhere just means where they've already looked. It does not mean that they have found all the records or even aware of other places where there are records. So this is very, very important thing to understand. So when I'm asked to review an end of line, here are the 5 things I usually find. I just need to kind of bring these things out at the beginning of this 5-part series so that you understand that these are the 5 things that are going to come back to you and haunt you if you are basically taking the position that you have an end of the line. Now, I really, really, really encourage people to get help and talk to people and talk to other genealogists and talk to experienced genealogists if you have any difficulty of thinking about where you're going to go next to find records for a particular ancestor. That's our function as people who are attempting to help, is to know, if not know all the records, at least know that there are records and know how to find the records. So that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in. So here's the first one. The real brick wall is 1 or more generations more recent than the target brick wall person. For example, the line ends some generation before the target brick wall person. This is number 1, the most common thing that I find. They're back in the 16 or 1550s or 1470s or something, and they're looking for somebody named John Smith, and they can't find John Smith, much less the parents. But it turns out that John Smith's, there is no documentation of any of John Smith's children down and grandchildren down to a reasonable expectation like 1600 or 1700. And that's where it really ends. It doesn't really end back there. And you can basically erase that whole section if you wish to do so. You can't erase anything on the Family Search family tree, by the way, unless you put it in and put it in pretty recently. And if you can detach it, but it just floats out there into space and becomes part of the unattached cloud of people in the Family Search family tree. If someone then finds that person, then it may show up as a duplicate. And that way, that's how those people eventually get incorporated back into the family tree. Or if you try to present a new person, they may come up with the person that's already there, and that may reattach those people. Okay, so this is the first rule. This is the first situation. The second one is the researcher's been looking in the wrong place or has been using the wrong name. Wrong place is about 90% of the time. Wrong name is about 10% of the time. It's almost always that the person, that a brick line, this one is the most common. I cannot overemphasize it. The most common problem is the place. They've exhausted everything in every record in Massachusetts, and you find out that the person moved to New York. And you haven't even looked in New York yet. Or you've spent the whole life looking in Berks County, Pennsylvania, and it turns out that the person moved West and lives in Ohio. And that's not the information that you were looking for, because you were looking for death records or marriage records or birth records, and you didn't look to land and property records, or you haven't looked at the tax records, or you wouldn't. One of my ancestors, direct line ancestors, I was able to show to the month when that person began, moved from Rhode Island to New York, by looking at the tax records, because they were clearly on every month's tax record until they disappeared. And that meant that they left, because there was nobody left to tax. Okay, the researcher quit looking long before the records ran out. And that's, I've already kind of mentioned, I won't harp any on that, but there are always more places to look. That's one of the basic rules of genealogy. The research on the target brick wall's children and grandchildren is incomplete or missing altogether. This is fairly common. It's often that I find that the people looking for the parents of a family before they have identified the children in the family. So you'll find one child, that'd be the direct line ancestor, and then the direct line parent, but you will not find any other children. Well, how about looking for where all the children were born for a beginning, which is one of the more basic things that you do when you review a person's family for any reason. Because if you find out that the latter children were born someplace before the earlier born children, then obviously there was a move. Why? That brings us to back to the first rule of genealogy, that when the baby was born, the mother was there. And if the baby was born where the mother was, and the mother wasn't where she was originally, then the mother moved. And if the mother moved, the rest of the family probably moved. And you say, well, what about divorces? What if the husband died? Well, okay, all those things. But the issue is we've got to show a parent-child relationship, and children come through the mother. So we are, more interested in following that than we are wherever the father happened to be. The last one is the researcher found the missing information but didn't realize it was the answer. Occasionally, when we go back through the sources that have now been attached to the family search family tree, lo and behold, we find that birth record that names the parents was been attached as a source for the last 5 years. And continued looking for it would have taken 2 minutes to click and read through all the sources. So encouraging everyone who's involved to read through the sources before you start looking for the next record, before you start trying to accumulate more. Make sure you know what you have. One of the early rules, not my rule, but one of the early general rules of thumb is to move from what you know to what you don't know. That's kind of a basic, a basic research provision. Excuse me. Okay, so now we're out of that. Before you claim a brick wall, ask yourself these questions. So here's some review questions you can ask yourself before you start to say, oh, I've got a brick wall, I can't get through this brick wall, and moaning and groaning or obsessing about, or waking up in the middle of the night and getting up and doing research, things like that, So first is, are all the conclusions made about the target person based on valid, reliable records and documents? In family search, family tree, occasionally, for example, today, I found a record that said, this record from MyHeritage substantiates the birth and children of this person. There was actually that note on the record, on the source as it was listed, which was listed to a source on MyHeritage. And so I thought, well, this is really good. I'll go look on MyHeritage. So I clicked on the link that the source had there and got to the source as it was on MyHeritage. And guess what? Everything in the source on MyHeritage had been copied from Family Search. So this person had simply used what was already existing in Family Search, which was miserably wrong, to substantiate something from just another website. So you really have to look at these documents and make sure that what you're looking at is something that even if it disagrees with your very closely held opinion and conclusion, that it is consistent with what is in those records, because it's the records that rule. It's not our opinions or our conclusions or our surmises or guesses. This is the other one. Are all the dates consistent and supported by documentation? Fortunately, Family Search is starting to notify you when someone has died, like a child is born after the father dies or the mother dies, or that children was born, that the parents were married, were not even born when they got married, things like that. All of those kinds of just simple, easily determined date issues are exactly what they are. They're easily determined. But there's all other kinds of things that may not be consistent. And it may not be obvious that there's an inconsistency. And I found, for instance, today was my day to see all of this kind of stuff in records that I'm looking at. And I'm researching my Jewish ancestors in the Netherlands and in England back into the 1600s. So I'm seeing all these things. So the first the thing I saw today was they said that somebody was buried in 1851, and looking at the rest of the records, it was obvious that this person lived in the early 1700s and died in 1751, even though the record itself said 1851. And that had been copied into the family tree, which caused the error message that says that this person had things that happened that didn't work with the times involved. But in that case, it was not obvious that there was a problem, because the record right there substantiated the date, and you had to go into the context of the date to see if that was something that was not consistent. So here's the other big one. Are the locations of the events accurately identified, consistent with the dates, and properly recorded? So, for example, Poland. Poland is a country. It's a country right now. It's a Western Europe or Central European country. Maybe could be considered an Eastern European country. And during many time periods in the past, at least two major time periods, Poland ceased to exist as an independent, discernible country. And the records that were generated were either in German or in Russian, depending on the time period. And the town names changed. And so there are at least 3 different town names for every Polish town. There's the original Polish name, there's a Russian name, or a German name, and or a Polish, Russian, and a German name. And so where you look for the records depends on who owned the property at the time, who claimed the property at the time. And that is that makes Europe absolutely dependent, European research absolutely dependent on history, because you need to know whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whether it was Austria, whether it was Hungary, whether it was some other, the Ottoman Empire, wherever it was. But those records are all going to be categorized differently and found in different places. And you need this timeline of the name of the location. And this occurs right up to the present. As towns get absorbed, as new towns are created. If you were living in in any of the states, Western states, it is very likely that you'd need a timeline of the towns and the counties and any place in the United States in the counties, because the counties' boundaries and identities have shifted in the names, and all of that it makes a big difference in where and how you find the records. So the number one issue with brick walls is the location. You really have to get down to the map and know what it is. And I would suggest this as something that I'll probably repeat, and probably in every one of these, and that is one of these series, and that is that, and probably in everything else I ever say about genealogy, and that is, if you don't check out the location, the first thing you do. So if somebody sits down with me and says, I need to ask you about this person, I'll say, when were they born? What time period are we talking about? And the next question will be, where did these things occur? Do you have an event, specified location for an event in the person's life, is the real question. And the answer will probably be no. It'll probably be something vague like Utah or Ohio or Germany or whatever, Denmark. And that really doesn't help. And that means that that person has gone beyond the brick wall. That's an automatic notification to you that you really don't know where this person is or who they are. And it's made up because the location is not specifically identified. Some location. It can be anything. It could be a land record. It could be a birth record. It could be a death record. It could be a burial record. It could be a marriage record. It could be any kind of record that's out there, a tax record. It could be anything, but it has to tie that person down to a physical location on the face of the earth. And that is what makes and determines whether or not you have a basis for finding more records that make sense. And that, why is this? The main reason is simple. There are so many people with the same names. Very rare, and I deal with thousands of names over the course of a year. Maybe more than thousands, who knows? But in dealing with those thousands and thousands of names, I find them to be totally repetitious. I don't know how many millions and millions of people have the name John or Juan or Joseph or Giuseppe or whatever. All of the simple, very common names out there. Okay. The next major issue is the lack of knowledge of the historical context. If you don't understand the history of what was happening at the time that the events occurred in your ancestors' lives, then you are simply floating out there without an anchor, and who knows where you will end up. And the most common error that I find in the United States is in people who have recorded the birthplace as being in a state that did not exist at the time. And the two most common are Kentucky and Tennessee. And if you don't memorize anything at all in your research in the United States, you should memorize the date of statehood of both Kentucky and Tennessee. At least know approximately when they were, and know enough to go look it up again if you can't remember it. And if you're like me and you look it up automatically anyway, because you're not sure if you remember it or not. Okay, so you really need to know the historical context because there's just no other way. And there's the third issue is relying on false assumptions unsupported by documents and records. Family traditions, that's number one. The Indian princes, the three brothers myth, all of the early, the lists, if you want an interesting situation, go look up online on genealogical myths. And you'll find that I've written a number of blog posts on it, and so have a lot of other people. And we always repeat the same myths. because there are things that come up. And I can go into any number of surname books, genealogical books compiled by families, and find this statement. There were 3 brothers that came from Ireland, and it starts just like that. It's incredible. It's never 4, and it's never 2. It's always 3. And so there's just a red flag, because you don't know. Maybe there were 5 and they only remember 3. It's just an interesting situation. So don't rely on that kind of stuff. Begin with the location and make sure you understand how or why the locations change. That's the historical research that should go into every effort to go back one more generation. You need to be absolutely sure these people. I had a whole troop of people in my genealogy who lived in Rhode Island and ended up in New York State. And so how did that happen? Why did that happen? And the answer of this one was that there were lots of children, and the ones who didn't inherit anything decided to go get their own land, and so they moved to New York. And then there's another situation. We had tons of people born in Connecticut, and they're showing up in Vermont. I go, well, why would anybody move to Vermont? And then they disappear in Vermont. And the answer is there was a huge land sale promotion among people in the lower New England states, in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and selling people the great land opportunities in Vermont. Well, they packed up their goods, they moved to Vermont, they stayed there until they found out that it was solid rock, wouldn't grow anything, and the growing season was about 6 months. It was about 3 months long. And then they decided to move back either to New York or back to Connecticut. So these are or they went west and ended up in Ohio. Does that sound familiar? Okay. Always be aware of the place name changes for the same place over time. I gave you the Polish example, but in many other cases, there are just cases all over the United States and every place else where the names of the places have changed. There are humongously large databases of names, of geographical names. We have a board on geographical names in the United States that has collected every name. In England, there are exhaustive lists. In Germany, there's the Myersort. There's books and online references that give you exhaustively lists. Google Maps is becoming one of the go-to places, or has been for years, the go-to place to find obscure things on the face of the earth, obscure places. But historically, there's a problem there, because historically it may have been identified by the original name and cataloged and stored under the original name of the place. And now the place no longer exists because it's not a place. So here's a challenge for you. Where are the records for the Panama Canal Zone being kept? Be sure to use all the current technology and all of the online sources, everything that's out there, every website. Another common one I run into, and I say, well, have you looked on Ancestry? Oh, well, no, I don't use Ancestry. I use Family Search. Well, have you looked for records on? Well, don't they all have the same records? No, they don't. They have a lot more records for some things. And then that goes for MyHeritage, that goes for Find My Past, that goes for all the other large online database record repositories out there, of which some are totally unassociated, not associated with genealogical. The term genealogy does not apply to them, but they have huge numbers of records. For example, the land and property records in the United States are rapidly being totally digitized and put online. None of that is in a genealogical context. It is all through the county assessors or county treasurers or the county recorders across the United States. Make sure you know what you know and what you don't know. Sometimes it's pretty easy to know what you know, but sometimes it's hard to know what you know, because you may already know the answer and you just simply don't recognize. Like I've said before, it could be there. You've already got the source, you just haven't looked at it. Or you already understand all this, but you don't understand that that already answers your question, that you basically are at the end of the line. And then you want to, if you don't know what you, and you need to know what you don't know. And that becomes pretty obvious when you go into a new area of research and having to learn a lot of things really quickly, because it's not something you're used to. Always take the opportunity to expand your knowledge and skills. Take classes, read books, study about the culture, the history, the religion of the places that you're researching. The more you know about local history, the more possibilities you have of discovering who these people were and why they were there and why they may have disappeared or why they're difficult to find. Going back in my own research, it became very obvious to me that any illusions that I had that I was going to connect with somebody who was prominent or important or was royalty just simply began evaporating after about 6 generations, because everybody that I ran into were just absolutely poverty stricken. And that brings up a whole new set of issues about doing research, because they weren't landowners. They didn't, they're just a very, very few records that can accurately find some people when you get back into the 1600s, into the early to the 1700s, who are very poor because they just, sometimes they didn't even have enough money to get married in the church, so they didn't. And that could be the possibility. And it just is interesting how people resist the fact of acknowledging that their ancestors were impoverished, and how the difficulties of finding somebody who doesn't have enough physical goods in the world to have a probate, because probate records are only available for people who actually own the property. And many of the people our joint ancestors were probably in the category of not owning any property. And then you have people like some of my poorest ancestors who were so poor that the parishes in England didn't want to support them. They had big families and they didn't want to go to the expense of putting up poorhouses and the poor unions, as they have in Europe. So under a law that was inaugurated in England, they said the easy way out of this, and so we don't have to take care of these people for the rest of their lives, is ship them on a boat to Australia or New Zealand, mostly Australia. And so 3 of my ancestral families were in that category. And they weren't criminals. They were simply people who qualified to get their passage paid to Australia. And they prospered and they did well. And that was a good benefit to the family, but it was very disruptive and required a substantial amount of research to track them. And now I have a whole, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of Australian relatives. And a lot of that work has been done over the years. Okay, now we're going to do in the last few minutes here, I'm going to do a quick case study and show by some dates and times and places that what the problems are. So we're going to look at Isaac Sheldon, 1682 to 1752, married in South Kingston, Kings County, Rhode Island, to Susanna Potter. And I'm simply going to illustrate the lack of a viable parent-child relationship here. He has 25 sources in the Family Search family tree. The number is inconsequential when we're talking about going back one relation, because so far there's only one source that identifies the name of his father, and that's John Sheldon. And the problem with that, as you'll see, because there's another John Sheldon who's supposedly his father, and the line does go back, but that's imaginary because there is nothing that clearly identifies John Sheldon, and we'll see how that works. So I need to look for some records for Isaac Sheldon that show his parents, or records for his parents that show Isaac Sheldon as a child. So those are the two kinds of records. There's lots of records, probate records, wills, land records. There's an endless type of records that can show a parent-child relationship. So it's not like we're looking for something that doesn't exist, like a birth certificate or something. Just to mention, birth certificates, by the way, were not common in the United States until the 1900s, and were not required in most jurisdictions across the country until in the 1920s. And some places did not require vital records be kept until the 1960s. So, you know, when you start looking for birth certificates, you've only got a few, maybe one or two or three generations that would even qualify to have a birth certificate. So is Isaac Sheldon or John Sheldon the brick wall, or neither? So the fact that I can get to John Sheldon and go back another generation to another John Sheldon, does that mean that there's no brick wall here? That, oh, we've got all these people identified for those who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the temple works have been all done, they've all been sealed, da 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 da. The answer is, yeah, and it could be all wrong too. So we find all these things happening when we get into this thing. We have birth after the mother's death. Look at that. John Sheldon, born 1665. Sarah Williams died 1662. Isn't that kind of an indication that John Sheldon and Sarah Williams were not the parents of John Sheldon? John Sheldon might have been, but Sarah Williams obviously wasn't, if that's a correct death date. Possible duplicate out there called Captain John Sheldon. As Captain John Sheldon shows up like kind of a ever-recurring ghost of the past. So here's a side-by-side with what happens with the two here, John Sheldon and Sarah Williams. First of all, we have birth in 6 February 1630 in Orton, Staffordshire. And then we have a birth of Williams in Rhode Island in 1620, a death in Providence of John Sheldon in 1706, and a death of Sarah Williams in 1662 in Newport, Rhode Island. Look at the sources, look at the memories, look at the collaborate. There are no sources for this. Where did we get a specific birth date in England? And how did we know this person was an immigrant and came to America? And how does we know that the English John Sheldon, who was born in Staffordshire, perhaps, which we don't know since we have no source that shows us that record, how do we know it's not made up? Well, we don't. And that's the answer to that question. So you just have to look there. You can see there's no sources, and there's no way in the world that these two people actually exist at this point in time. They have names, they have dates, they have places, but where do they come from? Oh, 1706 in the United States, 1662 in the United States, 1620 in the United States. Last time I checked, the United States didn't get to formally established until they signed the Constitution. Oh. Roger Williams established the first settlement in Rhode Island in 1636. And this person was supposed to have been born in 1620 in South Kingston, Washington, Rhode Island. The question you might ask is, so if you're so smart, you've done so much, then why haven't you changed this? Why haven't you corrected all this really outstandingly wrong information? It's because I have to leave something in here so I have examples. And so I don't automatically change everything, because sometimes it's so egregious, I want to use it in a presentation. No, actually, eventually it'll all get changed. But I do not have to go searching very far to find these examples, believe me. And I am absolutely obsessive about correcting them. These two people, as far as genealogical research goes, do not exist. At some point they may exist and their names may be the same, but right now we have nothing that tells us that they are there. Is John Sheldon a brick wall then? The one in 1665? Not until all of the potential sources have been searched. In other words, even though this information is on its face inaccurate and not correct, but that does not mean that it isn't that we're without sources. It's still not a brick wall, because these people are in New England supposedly, and there's more records than you can imagine. So finding them should not be overly difficult until there are no more records. Remember, location, location, location. That's it. That's the key to the whole thing. Thanks for watching.